Hi, I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in San Diego. Thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to support the work that we do here, please consider making a contribution. Go to our website. It's easy to do. Thank you in advance for that contribution. You know, we think of Valentine's Day as love between partners, and it certainly includes that. But I want to talk to you about love and about inner growth reflection in a much broader sense than just the kind of love that Hallmark writes about in its cards. We need to live the kind of love that every spiritual teacher taught, and certainly that Jesus taught, that we are to love one another and that we are to love even when it is difficult to do so, even when it is difficult to do so. You know, when you think about love in a broader sense, when you think about love in the social realm, it is justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. And we're all called to love in ever-expanding ways. But to do that really requires that we start right where we are with ourselves. And that's in part what Perini is writing about when he writes about the importance of love, and he identifies it as a spiritual law, that we have to start with ourselves. We have to start with how do we understand ourselves and how do we interact with the other, and what is the real purpose of relationship. Even that question is a question that probably few of us grew up being taught or being asked. It's often not until we've lived a few years and have experienced some of the challenges in our relationships that we begin to question, what is it really all about, and how do I navigate this thing in life called relationship? When I was in the prayer department, Silent Unity of Unity Worldwide headquarters many, many years ago, it was a job I held when I was in ministerial school, of all the prayer requests that we would get 24 hours a day, every day of the week, there'd be people answering the phones in Silent Unity. Of all the prayer requests we would get, the number one category was always prayer support for relationships, for healing of relationships. Relationships can be the most joyful part of our life, but have you noticed that they can also be the most challenging? We don't have to live too many years on this planet or be on the spiritual path very long before we come to understand and realize that relationships provide us the greatest opportunity for growth, the greatest opportunity for reflection, to really begin to understand ourselves and to understand the other. Because, and this is a first of several key points I want to share with you, this is because every person we meet reflects back to us something about ourselves. Every person we meet reflects back to us something about ourselves. Alan Cohen said, everyone and everything that shows up in our life is a reflection of something that is happening inside of us. And if it's true, and it is, that every person we meet reflects back something to us, then what we begin to realize is our usual approach of working at improving our relationships falls short of being successful, because the usual approach that we have in working to improve our relationships tends to be on the behavioral level. And while learning relationship techniques and changing some of our behaviors can certainly improve the quality of many of our relationships, it only goes so far. The real growth happens when we come to terms with this spiritual truth that every person we meet is reflecting back something to us about ourselves. And when we get that, then we begin to include ourselves in the picture of every dynamic in our relationships, not just the other and not just the behavior, but what is this saying about me? What is this pointing to in terms of where maybe
I am feeling insecure or where I have unfinished business from my past. Paul Ferrini suggests that we can make ourselves and others think and act in more loving ways. That's the behavioral. We can make ourselves and others think and act in more loving ways. But if we are conflicted within ourselves, he says, we won't be successful in the end. If we're conflicted within ourselves, we won't be successful in the end. Author Meg Wheatley wrote, without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating more unintended consequences. Without reflection. So a second key idea is a very real challenge that most people have is they're not willing to look more deeply inside themselves. And yet, when we embark on a spiritual journey, we're not going to be on that spiritual journey very long before we find the teacher or the book or whatever is helping us on the spiritual journey, pointing us back to ourselves, saying, have some quiet time, reflect, try to understand yourself better. Where is the hurt that you're feeling really coming from? Where is the anger really coming from? Where are the fears or insecurities you're feeling really coming from? Where is the woundedness? Reflect on that. You know, as we have been going through a very challenging time in our country, perhaps the most challenging we've been through, certainly in my lifetime, it's the most challenging, and we are seeing so much stuff come up to the surface in some of the most unskillful, horrific, and violent ways. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we've never gone deep enough as a culture, as a country, as a nation to really look at why is there this acting out in such a way? Why are there whole groups of people that feel so disenfranchised that the only way they know to try to get whatever it is they think is missing and that they need and want is through extreme acts of violence? Yes, if we're looking at this on a national scope, we would say that the behavioral changes would be legislative changes, and yes, some of that absolutely must happen. But that alone will not be enough. Just as working at the behavioral level in especially our primary relationships is seldom enough, we need to work at the deeper level, and invites us individually in our personal relationships, individually, to look more deeply at ourselves. And if we're talking about society, it invites us as a body politic to look more deeply at ourselves, to do our inner healing and growing work. Because if we don't do our own inner work, we will keep repeating the same mistakes. In our individual lives, we will keep drawing to us the same kinds of people. They may look different, but we will keep drawing to ourselves the same kinds of people, and the same kinds of issues will keep coming up for us because we haven't done our inner work. We haven't done our inner work. Jesus was a master teacher in always pointing people back to their inner work. What is that to thee? Come thou follow me. Let you who are without sin be the first to cast the stone. Why are you so concerned about the speck that is in your brother's eye? You don't see the log that is in your own. Each of these are tips of the iceberg of a story that the master teacher was telling us that always pointed back to working on ourselves. And I believe that work needs to be consistent, but it also needs to be done from a place of gentleness. You know, on Valentine's Day, we think of love for the other. It's important to also think of a love for self. Not the kind of love that excuses us and excuses bad behavior or excuses us from doing the inner work, but the kind of love that makes it safe to do the inner work. So a third of the key points that we need to really come to understand with this idea of relationships and how do we do them better is that few of us really have ever been taught the deeper truth about relationship. Think about the songs that young people grow up listening to. And I'm talking about the kinds of love songs that every generation has. They're not the same songs, but every generation. My generation had certain love songs, and my daughter and son's generation has certain love songs, and they're not necessarily the same. But the message is almost always the same. And the message is really a very distorted message of what love and what relationships are all about. It's so easy to walk away with either this saccharine view of relationships that, oh, when you finally find your soulmate, everything's always going to be perfect and there's never going to be a problem. Now, there may be one or two of you out there that have had that kind of relationship, but for most people, no, it's not like that. We're told these lies, or we want to believe these lies, that our relationships are easy, that our relationships, when we find that right person, that we're finally going to feel whole and complete, and that our relationships will always be on an upward spiral and always be fun. And they certainly don't require work. If they require work, there must be something wrong. And then we usually go to there must be something wrong with the other person. You know, the advanced spiritual course to me is about how we show up in our relationships. And do we understand the real purpose of relationship? And I'll be getting to that in a moment. Because if we don't deal with the inner stuff, if we don't understand that relationship does require reflection, it does require practice. It does require developing skill and insight. And it does require spiritual growth. If we don't understand that, we're not going to do the work that is necessary, and we're going to find ourselves rushing off to try to get something that nobody else can ever really give us. Another key idea is this, that if we have not done our inner work, if I have not done my inner work, if you have not done your inner work, you're going to go off unconsciously looking for what you didn't get growing up. I like the way Ferrini writes about it in this chapter. He talks about being taken in by the myth of romantic love. He says, we go out in search of a partner who will give us a love that we did not receive from our parents, and ironically end up with a partner who is a parental stand-in and replays all the roles our parents played. Destructive and abusive patterns are repeated so that they get our attention. Why? I like this. Because the role of relationship is not to compensate us for all the love we did not get as kids. It is to show us where we need to bring healing to the wounded child within our hearts and minds. The role of relationship is not to compensate us for what we didn't get somewhere along the line in growing up. It is to show us where we need to bring healing to the wounded child within our hearts and minds. He goes on to write, it is to show us the codependent patterns that cause our suffering and help us learn to give ourselves the love that we so desperately seek outside ourselves. Until we give up the myth that someone else is going to love us, heal us, or make us feel better, we will keep jumping into one codependent relationship after another. It is why I spoke to the idea before that if we haven't done our inner work, we're going to keep bumping up against the same patterns in our relationships, because that's what we're drawing into the light for us to be able to see and heal and transcend in ourselves. Relationship, to me, is the most powerful means for spiritual growth, more than any other area of our life. Our relationships, if we work them, if we understand them, provide us the opportunity to grow in huge ways, to awaken to the greatness within ourselves, the joy within ourselves, the uniqueness within ourselves, and to also awaken to those shadowy aspects of ourselves that need to be healed, that need to be corrected. And that brings me to what I think is the real gift of relationship. The real gift of relationship is to become conscious. The real gift of relationship is to become conscious. Conscious of the other, conscious of oneself, and conscious of what is created between the other and between the self. Relationship is the most rewarding and also often the most challenging aspect of our life. And this is why every spiritual teacher keeps pointing the student back to quiet reflection, pointing the student back to understanding oneself, looking with clear, kind eyes at oneself, not being afraid of seeing the shadow in ourselves, being willing to look at it, and then being willing to bring it to light, and being willing to heal whatever is behind that. I like this question that Farini poses in this chapter. He says, do you really think that you can be in an intimate relationship with someone without getting to meet your wounded child and theirs? I like that question. Think about the last time you had words or difficulty in a primary relationship, your intimate relationship, or a very, very close family relationship. See if you can reflect back on that and ask yourself, was some of this going on? And I bet you'll find that it was. Do you really think that you can be in an intimate relationship with someone without getting to meet your wounded child and theirs? He goes on to write, the purpose of relationship is not to love and to be loved. That sounds outrageous, doesn't it? But he says, the purpose of relationship is not to love and to be loved because we don't know how to do either. The purpose is to learn how to love and to learn how to be loved. To learn how to love and to learn how to be loved. Think about that for a minute. Think about that for a minute. That our relationships are about learning how to love and learning how to be loved. It's both ends, right? It's the giving of it and it's the receiving of it. We all know that in our close relationships, in our intimate relationships, in close working relationships or family relationships, that stuff happens, right? Just because we're spiritually practicing a particular path does not mean stuff isn't going to come up. We're human beings, right? And stuff comes up. We don't always see things eye to eye. We may not be feeling well. We may be tired. We may be frustrated. We may have had it with COVID and we're not at our best selves. Stuff comes up. But how we deal with that stuff says an awful lot about who we are and who we are becoming. How we deal with that stuff can be deeply spiritual. Have you ever thought of it that way? How you choose to deal with the tough stuff in your relationships can be deeply spiritual. Just think about a common thing that happens in relationships where one person thinks that they are right and the other is certain that they are wrong. Have you ever been there? Of course you have. If you're breathing, you've been there in an intimate relationship or in a working relationship where you've got two people and one is absolutely convinced they're right and the other is absolutely convinced that they're not right. We can dig our heels in when we feel that, no, I'm right, and resist the other, right? Why? There's a certain amount of ego involved in this. The ego likes to be right. It feels good to be right, doesn't it? You know, even if you don't express it, there's that feeling. It feels good to be right. And in contrast, for most of us, how does it feel to be wrong? Not so good. Not so good, right? To be right, we might feel empowered and validated, and when we are told we are wrong or we discover we are wrong, whether we admit it or not, we feel disempowered, or we might even feel shame, or we don't feel good. There was a point that Farini made in the book that I thought was a really interesting point. He said, what if we looked at being right and wrong in a different way? What if we interpreted it in a different way? He says, what if we took some of the pride and praise away from being right, because being right tends to feed our ego? What if we took some of the pride and praise away from being right, because being right tends to feed our ego, and feeding the ego doesn't usually help us to make much progress on the spiritual path? And if instead we looked at when we're wrong, that our ego is not being fed. Being wrong gives us an opportunity to be humble, to admit that we didn't know something, to admit that we didn't know something, to admit that, and this is the word, the meaning behind to be humble, to have humility, is to be teachable, to be teachable. And is that not a significant part of awakening and growing spiritually? To be teachable, to let your life teach you. And sometimes life teaches us through our relationships and through the tough spots in our relationships. And so I want to close with a suggestion that you and I diligently look at our relationships this week with really fresh eyes. And in particular, be aware of anyone that triggers you. Just be aware of anyone that triggers you. And when you feel that button being pushed, or when you feel yourself triggered, to stop for a moment and breathe into that, and to ask yourself, what important piece of information about myself might be trying to come up for me now? When you get triggered, when a button gets pushed, to take a deep breath and just ask yourself, I'm not going to blow that person off. I'm not going to reject the opportunity to learn and grow. But instead, I'm going to ask, what's deeper is going on? Did an old wound just get pricked? Is something else beneath this? And just be willing to ask the question, to ask it sincerely. What I have found to be true again and again is the genuine vulnerability and authenticity, the genuine being willing to ask a question like that, will often just open up the answer without any real effort on my part. And in that answer is a gem of self-reflection. It's like Paul, the Apostle Paul said, for then we saw in a mirror dimly, but now we will see face to face. So let us look at triggering people or triggering events with a deep breath and say, what else might be going on here? Namaste.